All right, looks like we're not really picking up anybody else, so let's go ahead and start. So up until this point, we've been, oh yeah, and if you can, I much prefer if you can turn your camera on if possible. So up until this point, we've been talking mainly about history, right? We've pretty much gone through all of human history up until about 300 years or so ago, right? And so the lesson from all that is that, you know, our social, economic, political system, capitalism, is not an inevitable part of human nature. It's actually an anomaly within the human experience that's really only at most 500 years old, right? So there's nothing natural about the system that we have today. And we, as I explained last time, we know the history of how this system started and emerged and developed and the rationalizations for it and so forth. So today that's what we're going to be talking about, right? Is the different theoretical frameworks for understanding capitalism. I labeled the lecture for today Marxist theory, but it's really not just Marx. I gave you the readings I gave you are from Marx because, you know, in 1 week, how much reading can I give you? But really what we're going to be talking about today is political economy, which if I was teaching a course on political economy, you would be reading a hell of a lot more than Marx. So I can't give you the whole range of classical theorists in political economy, but we're going to at least go over the three big ones prior to Marx, right? Which are consequently all Englishmen, John Locke, Adam Smith, and David Ricardo. So before we get into Marx, to provide you with background, right, some more history, but also some theoretical framework so you can understand what it is Marx is responding to, right? We're going to talk a little bit about who they were and what their, you know, perspectives were on the system, the economic system that was emerging during their times. So John Locke, who you may be familiar with from like a, you know, poli-sci class or, you know, American government or something, maybe, you know, he was had a tremendous influence on the founding fathers of this country. And there are many things in the Constitution that were really taken almost directly from Locke with very little modification. So our founding fathers thought the world of Locke. And so what did Locke think, right? Locke lived prior, you know, he was long dead when the Constitution, you know, when the U.S. got its independence from England. He lived from 1632 to 1704. 1632 to 1704. And he was an English aristocrat. Oh, you know, let me share my notes here with you. So he was an English aristocrat and landlord, as we talked about last time. So this is, you know, one of the people, he's thinking and speaking on behalf of the people who are collecting the rents that we talked about last time, right? So he's one of the winners out of this new system, this new land lease system, right, of agrarian capitalism that emerged out of the enclosure movement. And so he's thinking of, you know, he's trying to rationalize and to justify the system that already exists at that point, right? And his basic, the basic theory that he's known for is known as the labor theory of property and the labor theory of value. So we'll just call it together the labor theory of property and value. Cool. And first, with regard to property, Locke is trying to come up with a justification for why people like him have so much of it, right? And his explanation is not too different from those, you know, people who are, you know, in the aristocracy today, right? The 1%. His explanation for why he has so much property, people like him, is because they've worked hard for it, right? And so their hard labor has translated into property for them, and therefore they have a right to that property because the property is a result of their own labor. And so therefore, what gives property its value? Right? Where does value come from? Value comes from labor. And so the value of the property that someone like he has, right, is created by his hard work. Now, who's he leaving out of the equation here? Whose labor is he not considering?
Workers.
Right? The labor of the people who are actually working on his property, doing the manual labor and paying the rent and so forth, or working for a wage, right? In which case he gets to keep the profit. So he's really talking about himself. It's, you know, it's supreme hypocrisy, because what about the property rights and the value created by the laborers, right? Now, another concept that we attribute to Locke is the concept of improvement. We're going to be talking about this next week, or maybe the following week, when we're talking about the emergence of the race concept. But improvement is the idea that, I think we talked about this a little bit last week too, didn't we? Improvement is the idea that with the right to property, right, comes the responsibility of maximizing the profit potential of the property that you own. So if you own land, right, you have to put it to work. You have to employ people, and you have to, you know, grow crops and, you know, be industrious in maximizing the output of the property that you have control over. Right? And so therefore, if you have property and you are not maximizing the output, the profitability, right, then you're wasting it. And so you lose your moral right to the property. Now let's think about this in terms of, you know, the system we talked about last week, right? Where people are being forced off the land, and landlords are offering up their land for lease, and people are bidding on what they think the land is worth, you know, with a margin of profit for themselves. And people like Locke, who are able to, you know, succeed in this, you know, new system, and you know, produce and use the wealth of the profit that they make to acquire further holdings, right? They're the winners. But who's the losers is people who either can't, you know, aren't in a position to bid on land in the first place, or people who bid on land and then end up coming short. Remember, we talked about them, right? So what happens if you offer, you know, if you offer 80 bushels for access to a land for a season, right? And you come up with 100 bushels, cool, you get to keep 20. But what if you come up with 60? Right, what happens then? Well, under English law, you become the property of the landowner until you work off your debt. This is where indentured labor, we're going to talk about that next week. This is where indentured servitude comes from, right? So you're not just a landless peasant or a pauper, you're actually become the property of the person you owe the money to, because you're in debt and you can't pay it, you have to work it off. Right? So you have to work for them for however long they determine is enough to make up for the money that you owe them that you can't pay. So Locke is providing, you know, a theoretical framework for justifying this system, to justify this system. Right. Any questions about that? A couple other things, you know, a little bit more obscure that he's known for, one of which is the quantity theory of money. This is the observation that the more money you print, you know, the more money a state prints, the less it becomes worth, right? We call that inflation. So, you've seen this in real time in the last year. When COVID happened, the Fed printed all this money and they gave out all this, trillions of dollars in low interest, no interest loans to corporations and billionaires and so forth, right? And some hustlers here and there too, right? And so what's the result of producing all this extra currency in circulation is that the value of the currency has gone down. So inflation has gone up. Like in this last year, I think inflation, last number I saw was over 5%. All right. So if you had, $1,000 in the bank last year, this year, that same $1,000 is only worth, 900 something. Right. Another thing, kind of obscure, but I think, says a lot about Locke's perspective. Now, first of all, what's his concern with the quantity of money? Is that the more money that the state prints, the less his is worth, right? He's got a whole lot of it. He wants to maintain its value. So he's upset that the crown is printing, in his view, excess money. And it makes his money worth less. His solution, which this is very common view among conservatives today. I actually share this view, is that that our currency, the cash we use, really isn't worth anything. Exchanges should be made in gold and silver, which has intrinsic value to sedentary societies. So Locke, advocated for a gold standard. Ironically, we used to be on the gold standard. Or it used to be that the cash in your wallet, you could go and trade that in for silver or gold, right? And that's not the case anymore. And ironically, it was the conservative icon Dick Nixon who took us off the gold standard. So even though primarily conservatives are the ones that want us to go back onto it today. So anyways. Another thing about Locke that's really indicative of his character and his, just greed is that he was a very vocal critic of child labor. He wanted, at that time, labor standards in England were actually not too different from ours. When did you guys first start working your first real job? I think I was 15 or something when I think my first job was at Subways. Right. Well, back then in England, people generally didn't employ children below the age of 13 or 14. And Locke was outraged by this. In his view, there's all these, worthless eaters out there, children, who are not, producing anything. They're just, a leech on society as far as he was concerned. And so he advocated that, especially for the poor, for the landless peasants, that they should create, schools for young children that prepare them to be able to start working, to do something useful as early as possible. And he suggested that children as young as 3 could be working, carrying buckets, or who knows what he imagined, right? That better they should be, carrying buckets of dirt or water or whatever, in and out of the workhouses, then they should be sitting around doing nothing. And this type of sentiment is still today. People think that, children, you need to keep your children busy doing something all the time, right? Kids can't just be left to their own devices, right? We in our society, because we're a capitalist society, right? We have the belief that children should not be, idle, that we should keep them either in school or sports or clubs, and then when you become a teenager, that you should be working, right? Next up is Adam Smith. He was born in 1723 and died in 1790. His most famous work, The Inquiry into the Modes of Production and Wealth of Nations, something like that, the full title, we'll just call it The Wealth of Nations, was published in 1776, the same year as Ma Constitution, right? As the same year America got its independence from Britain. And he's most well known for the concept we call the invisible hand, right? And how does, in his view, how does the invisible hand work? Is essentially that if everyone in an economy, in a capitalist economy, of course, rationally pursues their own self-interest, right? If every supplier and buyer, every seller and consumer each has their own interest in mind, right? They'll have to meet somewhere in between. The seller of something wants to sell it for a very high price, but the buyer wants to resell it themselves, so they can't give all the profit to the supplier. They have to meet them, somewhere in between so that they have a margin when they sell it to the consumer, right? And so supply and demand, is this balance between, between different actors in the market's own self-interests. And when all of these self-interests operate, concurrently, they even each other out and an equilibrium is found in terms of supply and prices, right? And so how does that work? If the price of something increases, right, what happens to the production of it? Producers will increase production because they can make more money by making more of it at a higher price, right? And as the supply increases, what happens to the price? The price decreases. And so it's this constant balance of equilibrium of supply and demand and prices somewhere in between. Now, according to Smith, in order for the economy to work at its maximum efficiency, firms should have a division of labor. Right? So there should be a division of labor both within firms, right, and between firms. So, for example, I'll use Subway because that was my first job when I was a kid, and you guys have probably gotten a sandwich at Subway. When Subway's at its peak, hours for lunch or whatever, right? How do they make the sandwiches? There's one person that takes your order and asks what bread you want. Then there's another person that does the meats and cheeses and whatever, or toasts your sandwich. Then there's someone else on the, vegetable station that, does all that. And then someone else rings you up. Why doesn't the same person just start with your piece of bread and walk down the line and then ring you up and they just cycle around like that? Because it's more efficient to have this, assembly where each person is focused only on one specific task. And so Smith is the one that said that this is how, firms should be organized, where in order to maximize the exploitation of labor, right, to maximize the amount of production you get for each labor hour, for each amount of, labor that you're paying for, is to have each laborer specialize in one specific task so that they can be as efficient as possible in that task. And if each of them is lined up doing all the different tasks that are required, the whole process will be much more efficient and faster and produce more, have a higher production with the same amount of labor input. Does all that make sense? The person who is, Americans credit with, instituting this system is Henry Ford, right? Ford's, production line for his Model T cars, whatever. But the division of labor is something that traces back to Adam Smith. So, having said all this, Adam Smith recognized an inherent threat to the the invisible hand, right? This system of everybody rationally pursuing their self-interest and equilibrium being achieved between supply and demand and price, right? And the threat that could throw the balance, the scales off, is the threat of monopoly and cartels, right? So monopoly is when one firm gains control of an entire industry, right? And a cartel is when all of the firms in a particular industry collude together to control prices artificially instead of competing against one another. So Smith said that these, basically, this type of corruption of business interests intruding into government to allow them to achieve these, anti-competitive advantages in the market, right? Throw the whole thing out of whack. And so monopolies and cartels should be strictly regulated and dismantled wherever they occur. Cool. Any questions about Adam Smith? Next up is David Ricardo. Ricardo might sound Spanish, but he's actually an Englishman. He lived from 1772 to 1883. So we're in the 19th century here. And he had another take on Locke's theory of property and value. He said, well, labor, Locke said that labor is what gives property and value, right? Gives the right to property and what creates value. And Ricardo said, well, you're given, here you're giving credit to the workers. It's not the workers, right, who are the key to this, equation. There's three portions to the equation: the land, the labor, and the capital. And so what he's saying, it isn't that, Locke was saying that it's the business owner's labor that gives him the right to the business. Well, Ricardo kind of recognizes the hypocrisy in that, and he says, no, what the business owner is contributing is the capital, right? Without the capital to pay the workers and to buy, to secure a building and buy the tools or machinery needed to, engage in production, the land and the labor would be worthless by itself. It would just be a bunch of landless peasants and a bunch of worthless, land with nothing on it. It's, in Ricardo's view, it's the capital that makes that is the binding agent that brings the labor and the land together into a productive capacity. So Locke and Ricardo are both giving the proprietor, the entrepreneur, the credit, but with slightly different, theories of how that, why they're the key to the process of production. So that's David Ricardo's labor theory of value. Now, Ricardo is most well known for his advocacy of what we now call laissez-faire economics, right? Which essentially means in French, do as you will. In English, we say free trade, right? And free trade is kind of an application of the division of labor that Smith was talking about on an international scale. So Smith was saying, individual firms should have the labor, divided according to different tasks, and then each firm will be most efficient. And then also the different firms should dominate in different industries, right? That there should be a firm should specialize in, manufacturing iron and steel, or in, animal husbandry or textiles or whatever it may be, right? That firms shouldn't be trying to get involved in two different industries at the same time. They should specialize in different industries, right? And if each firm is specialized in different industries and each firm has a division of labor in its own, production facilities, then the whole economy will run as efficiently as possible. That's what Smith said, right? So Ricardo expanded this on an international level, said, well, you know what? Different countries have, he didn't use this term, one of his students, John Stuart Mill, used this term. Different countries have a comparative advantage, right? For example, France is great at making wine and cheese, right? Well, in England, the climate is not very conducive to growing, vines to produce wine. So it's much more efficient for the French to produce wine than for the English to produce wine. But in England, because it's cold and you can't really grow grapevines that well, right? But being cold is great for raising sheep because they grow this thick, dense wool. So England should specialize in textiles. And then England can trade its textiles to France for their wine and cheese. Why should each country try and produce everything it needs domestically when different countries, based on their climate or their population or whatever, what have you, right? Different countries are better at producing different things. And so each country should focus on maximizing production in the sector of the economy that they have a comparative advantage in. Right? See, this is, if you think about it, this is a justification for the plantation system in the colonial world, right? Why should colonies have these plantations that are growing cash crops, sugar or tobacco or mining for silver or gold or whatever it may be, right? Because they have the climate to grow sugar, tobacco, whatever it is, right? They should focus on that because you can't grow sugar in England. So the colonies should focus on sugarcane production, and England should focus on manufacturing goods, say, for example. Right? And if every different country in the world focuses its efforts on producing the products that it has a comparative advantage in producing, then what's going to happen is going to be better for everyone. There's going to be this market where things are going to be cheaper because their production is maximized. And so the exchange value of different things will lead, everybody will exchange what they have and receive what everybody else has, and everybody will just go home happy. Right? What's the problem with this? Has there ever been such a thing as free trade? Right? Now he's saying this in response to the mercantile system. Remember we talked about the mercantile system last time? Remember the old system is that companies were actually funded and backed and represented the government of the country they came from, right? The Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, and so forth, right? These companies weren't, independent entrepreneurs. They were represented and backed by the government of their country. And so the government of their country sought to establish a monopoly on trade, right? And to prevent its competitors from trading in the same markets. Ricardo is saying, no, that's the wrong way to go. Every country should open its markets and focus on producing what it's good at producing, and having open markets with no barriers to trade between the different countries, the world economy will work, its magic. It will have the most efficient, economy possible. Does that make sense, guys? The problem with this is that this has never really happened, right? Particularly European superpowers, but also other countries like China, has over the centuries has been very protective of its trade, but also, much to the chagrin of European powers. But European powers themselves have been very protective, right, of their own markets, and in attempting to curb the opportunities of their competitors. And that's even true today, right? Like still to this day, Cuba has an embargo against it. Cuba doesn't have free trade. Like, isn't this America? And aren't we for free trade and freedom? And then why are we embargoing this other country? For the same reason countries have always embargoed, particularly European powers have embargoed their political rivals, right? Look at every, world war and, conflict between European powers. In every single one, they embargoed each other. Why did America get involved in World War I? Because the Germans and British were trying to embargo each other, and a German submarine sank the Lusitania, which was an American ship, right? There wasn't no free trade during a world war, right? And this is, the historical pattern that, particularly European superpowers have taken, which is to be protectionist in their own trade, right? And then to invade other countries to open up their markets to become part of their monopoly, right? Another example, of course, is Brexit, right? You guys heard about that? The United Kingdom, England has pulled out of the European Union, right? So they basically ended free trade between Britain and the rest of Europe, which is just lovely to watch them dismantle their own economy to go against their own values that they've imposed on the rest of the world for the last 300-400 years, right? So anyways, Ricardo is the classical theorist who's given credit for this, free trade theory. Okay, so that's kind of our setup for our discussion about Marx. Any questions about the classical political economy that I talked about so far? Let's talk a little bit about Marx's personal life before we get into the readings for today. Karl Marx was an enigma of a man. I have to disclaimer that while I agree with the analyses in the readings today, I'm not a Marxist. Politically, I'm an anarchist, and we don't get along much to, probably the opposite of what you would hear on Fox News, but there's actually a lot of disagreements among us. And principal among them is the role of the state in a revolution to dismantle capitalism. Marx and Marxists, the states that were created from his theory, the Soviet Union and Communist China and Cuba and North Korea and so forth, right? All of these states became, essentially dictatorships with control economies. And that's no accident, that's part of what Marx was advocating. He was advocating for a revolution where people like him, smart guys like him would determine everything for everyone else. And in his own life, his own praxis in trying to organize, he was very dictatorial in his, praxis and his ambitions. The International Working Men's Association and what happened to it is a good example of that. At that time as well, anarchists and Marxists were on opposite sides of the fence, and Marx's primary opponent on the anarchist side was a man named Mikhail Bakunin, who we'll read a little bit from later in the semester. And Bakunin was also a revolutionary, but he believed that people needed to seize their own freedom and seize control of their own communities, and that we don't need a centralized state to dictate to us, what we do and what we can and can't do. And so him and Mark, he opposed Marx within the International. Marx wanted the International to be essentially like, he wanted to be the leader of it. He was elected, but he basically wanted to run it by fiat. Bakunin and the anarchist faction opposed that and would constantly critique Marx and denounce Marx and so on and so forth. The International was founded in 1862 and collapsed around 1872 or 73, so it lasted for about 8 years or so. And the reason it collapsed was pretty much entirely Marx's fault, due to his own, machinations and ego and ambition to control the group, the organization. But Marx, let's give a little bit of background for Marx and Bakunin's lives before we talk about that. Marx was born to an upper middle class family in what's now Germany. Of course, the country of Germany that we're familiar with didn't exist at that time. Germany, the country, was invented in 1871. Marx lived in one of the primary predecessor state to the modern country of Germany, which was Prussia. Prussia is like Russia, but with the P in front, Prussia. And so Marx, his father was a lawyer and also owned some vineyards. So, they're pretty well off. And he wanted Marx to become a lawyer as well because he thought it would be financially secure. But Marx was more interested in philosophy. And when his dad sent him to university, he became politicized and got involved in politics and worked different jobs, political type of jobs for newspapers and, so on and so forth. He joined different socialist social clubs, which in Germany were, basically they would meet at the beer hall and drink all night and talk politics. And he married the daughter of a very wealthy family. So he, this isn't someone who grew up in poverty, is basically what I'm getting at, right? But because of his politics in his adult life, he had to leave Prussia and go to France. And then he ended up going back to Prussia and then back to France. And then there were basically reactionary governments seized power in both countries. And so he ended up being exiled to England and lived most of the, significant, not all of them actually, but a lot of the significant works, particularly his magnum opus, Das Kapital, was written in England. He would have moved to England around the uprising, the revolution of 1848. So he would have moved to England around 1850, something like that, and lived basically the rest of his life in England. He met his primary primary collaborator and best friend, Friedrich Engels, while he was in Paris, I believe. And they hit it off immediately. And they had a lot in common theoretically, but also Engels was another German or Prussian expatriate who happened to be from a wealthy family. And so he was able to kind of support Marx financially after they moved to England to some extent. Marx would have little odd jobs. He wrote a column for an American newspaper. He wrote, different things. He, did little archiving jobs and I don't know what else. But he wasn't rich by any means. He had a housekeeper, so I suppose he wasn't starving, but, he was definitely he wasn't wearing fancy clothes and, he definitely was living a pretty humble life most of the remainder of his life in England. Actually, him and his wife had 7 children and only 3 of them survived to adulthood. So, clearly he wasn't, in the upper echelons of society or anything. But he was, of course, very well educated and as far as politics was, at the highest levels, and spent most of his time in England studying and writing. In London, they have, the King's College, the amazing libraries and stuff. Probably the best libraries in Europe, or if not the world, maybe not the world, but certainly in Europe at that time. And so he made use of that and read through all of the classical political economy, the stuff that I just taught you, plus a whole bunch of other stuff that, David Hume and um, Bentham and all these other people, classical political economists. And he read a lot of, he assembled all the economics data he could get his hands on to try and understand the economy and so forth. And so what came out of all of this research that he did was this magnum opus, Das Kapital, or Capital in English. So we're going to read something from Capital in a minute. But first we're going to read something that came a little bit earlier. Bakunin also was born to a noble family in Russia, actually. He had a title of nobility that he renounced when he became a revolutionary, and he was, he fled Russia to avoid being arrested. And lived most of his life in Switzerland, though he was constantly traveling around Europe trying to rabble rouse, trying to get people to start revolutions. And whenever a revolution would look like it was starting somewhere, he would jump on a train and head straight there and try and get involved. Like Marx, he was late for the 1848 revolution, but there was an attempt at a revolution in Austria, and he went there to join and to help. And the revolution was put down by the Austrian government, and he was taken into custody. He was arrested by the Austrians, and they turned him over to the Tsar of Russia. And he ended up spending over 10 years. I think he's over 12 years total, but 10 years in the most draconian prison in the world at the time, the Peter and Paul Fortress in St. Petersburg. So he had a pretty rough time. He was always trying to overthrow governments, but he paid for it dearly. And then he was actually broken out of the prison. His friends, they had this, miraculous heroic escape where some friends pulled up on a horse and he jumped on and they took off with him. And there's this famous story that all night, as the Tsar's secret police were tearing apart working class neighborhoods looking for him, he was at the nicest restaurant in St. Petersburg having dinner. So he ended up traveling all the way through Siberia and through the United States, all the way around the world to get back to Europe. And then, ended up joining the International Workingmen's Association. And there was this tension between them that I talked about. And Marx ended up getting Bakunin kicked out of the organization because prior to being arrested, Bakunin had accepted, I don't know, a couple of $100 to do a translation of a book. And of course, because he'd been arrested, he wasn't able to complete the translation. But because he'd been in prison all these years, he didn't have the money to give back either. And so, he wasn't trying to burn the guy that he had contracted for the translation, but that's basically how Marx put it, that he was dishonest and he had, robbed conned this guy and defrauded somebody. And so he was kicked out of the International Workingmen's Association, and the whole anarchist faction, left with him, and the whole thing collapsed. So Marx's, machinations for dictatorship of the International led to its demise during his time. It shouldn't surprise anyone that his frameworks, ended up into, what Lenin and Trotsky created, and what Stalin, what became Stalinism and Maoism and all the rest of this stuff. So that's, I guess that's all I ought to say about Marx's personal life and career. Do you guys want to take a break before we get into the readings, or should we just keep plowing ahead? Any opinions either way?
I don't think it matters.
Break, keep going, no break, keep going. Okay, it looks like we have more keep goings than breaks, so I'll just keep going. drink something real quick. All right. So wage, labor, and capital. That's the first one we're going to talk about. This was written in 1847. This is before he went to England. And I think what I'll do for you guys for this is, I know if you've already opened up the book, it's, this is old material and the writing is very dense and obtuse and it's difficult to understand what the hell he's talking about for you. I can appreciate that. So what I'll do is I'm going to read a few short passages through the reading that you were assigned, and then we'll talk about it and try and translate what the hell he's talking about in common vernacular. Sound like a plan? So these are the same books that your readings were copied from. This is actually my original copy from when I was an undergrad. A long time ago. When did I start college? In 1996. Some of you guys probably weren't even born in 1996. So this is a very old book. So let's start on page 204. If you have your readings, you can follow along, or if not, you can just listen along. Wage, labor, and capital. Wages is about halfway down the page on 204. Wages are the sum of money paid by the capitalist for a particular labor time or for a particular output of labor. The capitalist, it seems, therefore, buys their labor with money. They sell him their labor for money. But this is merely the appearance. In reality, what they sell to the capitalist for money is their labor power. Labor power, therefore, is a commodity. Right? So what's he saying here? Right? When you go to work, right, you're selling yourself. I know it feels like you're selling your soul, doesn't it? You are. We only have a limited amount of time on this earth, right? Why are we spending the limited time we have working for someone else? Right? That's an exchange that you're making, right? It's a market exchange. Your time, your labor power is a commodity that you're exchanging in a labor market for what? For a wage, right? Down at the bottom of the page, labor power is therefore a commodity which its possessor, the wage worker, sells to capital. Why does he sell it? In order to live. He works in order to live. So how many of you guys hate your job? How many of you guys think about something else you'd rather be doing than going to work?
Yeah, definitely.
Why you guys keep going to work when, like you could probably be doing any number of things that would make you much happier? I like my job. I just hate some of the people. But I'd rather be in Maui, swimming with the fish, let me tell you, drinking a Mai Tai on the beach. Here I am. Right? So why do we go to work? What happens if we don't go to work?
Get bored, no?
We starve. We got to keep a roof over our head and food on our plate, right? And because we've been separated from the land, we don't have the ability to provide for our own sustenance. So the only way for us to be able to keep a roof over our head and food on our plate is to go and work for somebody else for a wage, right? We don't really have a say in the matter. So think about if labor is a commodity and there's a labor market where we exchange our commodity, our labor, our time out of our lives for a wage, is this a balanced negotiation between us and the and our employer? What happens if our employer doesn't hire us? Just hire somebody else, right? What if we decide, you know what? I'm worth a lot more than that. I don't think I'm going to be able to come to work for you if that's all you're paying me. You starve, right? So you are in a very disadvantaged position in this, supposedly free market, right? You have the employer has a far better, superior dominant negotiating position compared to you, because he can bluff and you can't. He knows if you don't take this job, fine, I'll just hire somebody else. You could starve for all I care, right? Bottom of page 205. The worker leaves the capitalist to whom he hires himself whenever he likes, and the capitalist discharges him whenever he thinks fit, as soon as he no longer gets any more profit out of him, or not the anticipated profit. But the worker, whose sole source of livelihood is the sale of his labor power, cannot leave the whole class of purchasers, that is, the capitalist class, without renouncing his existence. He belongs not to this or that capitalist, but to the capitalist class, right, in its entirety. So you might hate your job. Anybody ever do this? You're like, man, fuck this job. Fuck you. I'm out of here. Right? Anybody ever like make a scene at work and just fuck all you, I'm out.
Not yet.
You're contemplating it, right? Like, damn, I wish I could do that. You watch videos of it on YouTube all day. Oh, that's going to be me someday. I'm telling me, fuck you. Yeah, I'm out of here. Right? But what happens when you do that? You go home, you're like, yeah, I told them. Woohoo. Stood up for myself. Yeah. Raise our fists in the air. But then what happens the next day? You got to go look for a job somewhere else. Right? Free for a day. And then you got to start back from scratch and get some other person, some other asshole to hire you to do something you don't want to do. Right? So you really have no freedom here, right? Because you might be able to withhold your labor from one capitalist, one particular business, but you can't withhold your labor from the labor market itself, because you have to sell your labor on the labor market or you starve. Right? So you might think that you have some freedom in that you're not a slave, right? They don't own you. Your employer doesn't have, you're not like a serf that you can't leave the company. But can you leave the labor market entirely? No, right? So you are a slave. You're just not owned by any particular master. You're owned by the entire class of masters. You have no choice but to work for some of them or one of them, right? You can't escape and set up your own. You can't provide for your own sustenance. Why? On whose land are you going to do this? The capitalists own all the property, right? You're stuck. Still, hundreds of years later, landless peasants. Probably never thought of yourself as a landless peasant, right? That's what you are, right? You have to work for somebody else, because if you don't, you're going to starve. Now, what determines how much your wage is? How much you guys make at work? $15 an hour, $20 an hour, maybe a little more if you're lucky, right? What do they say you have to make in order to pay rent in Los Angeles? Which nobody makes that much, right? That's why we all live with family and roommates and all this. So what determines the wage that we or anyone else in any capitalist society is paid for their labor? Do we sit down with our employers and negotiate? Well, how much money does this company make a year? Well, this company produces $1 million of profit every year. Okay, let's split that. Well, there's 5 of us working here and you're the owner, and so we'll take 500,000, 100 each, and you'll keep 500,000. You put in the money, we put in the labor, meet you right in the middle. Invisible hand at work. Is that how it works? No, right? Why not? Because you don't have any negotiating position to start from, right? You got to take whatever they offer you, the best offer you get. And what's the best offer they're going to give you? They don't care if you don't take the job, because they'll just hire someone else. So what's the floor? What's the minimum that they can pay? What's the limit on the bottom limit of what limits their ability to pay you nothing? Well, the reason that you're working is in order to earn enough food, to put food on your plate and the roof over your head. So your basic sustenance, right? Your subsistence level is the absolute minimum that the entire capitalist class can pay. Because if they don't pay that much, then all the workers are going to die, and who's going to be working for them to make profits, right? So that's what we call the minimum wage, which is supposedly the minimum amount of money it takes to not die. For the labor class, us all together, to be able to reproduce itself for the next generation of workers and the next generation of capitalists to make a profit off of that. Where is the lie? Page 208 to 209, so bottom of 208. The existence of a class which possesses nothing but its capacity to labor is a necessary prerequisite of capital. It is the only domination of accumulated past materialized labor over direct living labor that turns accumulated labor into capital. The worker receives means of subsistence in exchange for his labor power, but the capitalist receives in exchange for his means of subsistence labor. The productive activity of the worker, the creative power whereby the worker not only replaces what he consumes, but gives to the accumulated labor a greater value than it previously possessed. The worker receives a part of the available means of subsistence from the capitalist. For what purpose do these means of subsistence serve him? For immediate consumption. As soon, however, as I consume the means of subsistence, they are irretrievably lost to me unless I use the time during which I am kept alive by them in order to produce new means of subsistence. What is he saying here, right? The wage that's paid to the laborers, what do they do with that? You guys get your check every month or every couple of weeks or whatever it is for your job. Where does that check go?
To rent.
Right? Easy come, easy go. Right? Except it ain't easy coming. Right? How many people put away half of their paycheck every month?
I try.
Anybody even put away 20% of their check every month? Anybody even put away 10% of their paycheck every month? How many come up short many months of the year and have to make up for that with a credit card? What happens to all of the wages that we're working and spending our lives for? We consume them immediately. And once we've consumed them, they're gone. So we have nothing in the future for everything we've worked for. Right? Now let's look at the capitalist position, the entrepreneur, our employer. Right? He's receiving more money in profit than we're receiving in wages, likely, right? much more than his own personal consumption needs could ever, eat into, right? Let's think of the extreme example. Anybody here work for Amazon? Anybody work for Bezos or Whole Foods? Or what else has he bought out? Kohl's? I don't know what else. Pretty soon he's going to own the post office, right? Jeff Bezos is worth $200 billion. Can you even wrap your mind around how much money that is? Like you hear it, but I don't think you can really contemplate how much money this is. Can Jeff Bezos ever consume even a fraction of that? How much food can you eat? Even if you just eat caviar and drink, Chateau 1932 or whatever, you can't even scratch that much money, no matter how many parties you go to and, how many vacations you take, right? So what happens? What is all of that wealth? That's not for his consumption. What happens to the wealth that he accumulates by appropriating these profits that are produced by his workers' labor, right? He takes that wealth and that becomes the capital that he uses to expand his business even further, right? Putting more people under his control, having even more workers working for him, right? So his wealth builds over time, whereas the workers are never able to get off square one because they have to consume the wages that they're paid in order to live, right? So let's think about that in terms of David Ricardo's, theory about capital being the key factor, between land, labor, and capital. Capital is what ties it all together, right? According to Ricardo. Marx is saying, well, wait a minute. How does that capital even exist in the first place? That capital was created by the labor of the workers that was appropriated by the business owner as profit. So should that capital belong to the owner, or should it belong to the workers whose labor made it possible in the first place? Right? So he's calling bullshit on Ricardo here. He's saying, you're saying that it's the capital that gives the entrepreneur the right to the profit. That's a circular argument. What came first, the chicken or the egg? Clearly, the reason that capital exists in the first place is because you profited off someone else's labor. And then you took that profit and flipped it into even more profit and even more profit, right? What do the laborers have to show for that? Nothing. So that's not your capital you're, entrepreneuring with. That's the laborers, that's their hard work. That's hours, days, and years of their lives. That's their blood, sweat, and tears that you're investing and growing as your wealth, right? It shouldn't belong to you in the first place. It should belong to the workers whose labor created it, right? Not that the business owner, clever manager, isn't also due some compensation for their hard work, but should their compensation be more than the hard work of the people who do the manual labor? Right? This is what Marx is questioning. Page 211. Profit and wages remain as before in inverse proportion. If capital is growing rapidly, wages may rise. The profit of capital rises incomparably more rapidly. The material position of the worker has improved, but at the cost of his social position. The social gulf that divides him from the capitalist has widened. Let's think about this in relation to Amazon as well, right? You might be surprised to hear that Amazon actually pays pretty well for a scumbag company, right? They pay, I think they start at like 20 bucks an hour, which is well above minimum wage. There's all these other companies complaining, we can't hire enough workers because Amazon's paying them $20, right? Sounds good for the Amazon workers, doesn't it? Wow, I used to be making $15. Now I'm making 20. ballin', see you at the club, pop bottles. No, right? Is it extra $5 an hour? Where does that extra $5 an hour go towards? Your consumption still, right? It's not like you're putting away that extra $5 an hour into your, Roth IRA. Probably most of y'all, how many people here even have a Roth IRA? Right? Now let's think about what's happened to Bezos's wealth over the same time period during the pandemic. Like almost doubled, right? $200 billion this dude is worth. So Bezos is saying, hey, you guys are doing better. Look, you're making $20 instead of $15. But the gap between us and Bezos went from here to the moon, where he wants to fly, apparently. Right? So we might think that we're doing better because the business is doing better. Look, I got a raise. I'm getting paid more. But look at how fast your wage is raising. And then look at how fast the value of the company is raising. Right? You're getting left in the dust. And you're so dumb, you think that you have a better position. Right? When really the gap between you and them is widening and widening and widening and widening, infinitely, essentially. Bottom of 211 onto 212. One capitalist can drive another from the field and capture his capital only by selling more cheaply. In order to be able to sell more cheaply without ruining himself, he must produce more cheaply. That is, raise the productive power of labor as much as possible. But the productive power of labor is raised above all by a greater division of labor. Right? Remember we mentioned Smith? By a more universal introduction and continual improvement of machinery. Hence, a general rivalry arises among the capitalists to increase the division of labor and machinery to exploit them on the greatest possible scale. So the capitalists, the entrepreneurs, they're locked in this system too. They have an imperative, which is to outperform their competitors. And how do they increase their market share in whatever industry they're operating? They have to undercut the prices. Remember, supply and demand. They have to undercut the prices of their competitors so that people will buy their products instead of their competitors, and they'll do more volume in the long run. Right? Making big money is about volume, not margin. Right? Now, what's the problem with this for workers? What's the only way to lower prices and increase volume is to squeeze the workers for more productivity in the same labor hours, right? Just like we talked about. So by a division of labor, you turn the workers into machines, right? Where one person just stamps one little rivet all day, and the next person stamps the next one, right? It's like you turn your workers into automatons. And then to make matters even worse, you replace them with machines, right? You come up with more and more technology that does the labor of the workers, right? And if the business is working more efficiently, right, because so much of the labor has been mechanized, is the owner increasing wages to share this added productivity with the workers? No, the owner is keeping wages as low as possible in order to be able to undersell his competitors. Right? See the logic of the whole system? Let's go to the end. Last two pages, 216 and 217. Let us sum up. The more productive capital grows, the more the division of labor and the application of machinery expands. The more the division of labor and the application of machinery expands, the more competition among the workers expands and the more their wages contract. Thus, we see if capital grows rapidly, competition among the workers grows incomparably more rapidly. That is, the means of employment, the means of subsistence of the working class decrease proportionally, so much the more, and nevertheless, the rapid growth of capital is the most favorable condition for wage labor. So what's the problem here for workers? As they become more efficient, less and less of them are needed. As machines come and take over the work that workers used to do, less workers are needed in the workplace, right? And so therefore, the workers who are still working have to compete with the people who aren't working for their jobs. They're not in a position to get a raise, right? Because someone else is right there to take their job if they don't want to do it anymore for what they're being paid. Make sense? And that is an excellent transition into our next discussion, which expands on that point. This is from Das Kapital, Marx's magnum opus. This is the first of 3 volumes. Anybody still want to go to graduate school? Where you have to read all 3 if you're actually on your shit. So anyways, what we're going to read, what I've assigned for you guys is chapter 25, sections 3 and 4, which discusses the concept of the surplus labor population. Now, let me give you a caveat here. You know, I don't mind you guys going online and Googling these concepts so that you can read, you know, Wikipedia. I suggest Wikipedia. You know, Wikipedia, most Wikipedia pages are written by grad students who know what they're talking about, right? Whatever else you want to read on there. A lot of universities have stuff about Marx, whatever, but there's 2 different concepts from Marx. One is surplus labor and one is surplus labor population. So make sure that you're searching the right term and finding the right content, right? There's always, you know, there's always cheaters out there who Google stuff online and then copy what's online and put it in their paper. Don't do that. Turnitin is going to catch you. I'm not going to accept your paper. I'm going to give you a big fat 0, and then you're not going to do well in this class. So please don't do that. But if you do that, or then the other version of that is students pay someone else, probably a grad student, to write their paper for them, right? And the grad student may not be very well versed in Marxism and probably isn't going to do the reading themselves. They're going to look it up online and write the paper based on what they saw online. They're going to look up surplus labor and write me a paper on surplus labor instead of a paper on surplus labor population. That's kind of a red flag for me that you're cheating, right? Don't do that. So surplus labor population, chapter 25, section 3 and 4 of Das Kapital. Let's start off with a quote from page 782 of this version. It is capitalist accumulation itself that constantly produces, and produces indeed in direct relation with its own energy and extent, a relatively redundant working population, a population which is superfluous to capital's average requirements for its own valorization and is therefore a surplus population. On the next page, the working population therefore produces both the accumulation of capital and the means by which it is itself made relatively superfluous. And it does this in extent which is always increasing. So what's he saying, right? Think of what we just talked about with surplus, with wage labor and capital, right? As firms increase the productivity of the workers by division of labor and by the introduction of machinery and increasing technology, right? What happens? It takes less workers to do the same work. What happens to the workers who used to do that work? They're shit out of luck. They're on the job market, right? They're put back into the labor market. They are superfluous to the process of production. They are a discarded labor population whose labor is no longer useful to capital because it can't be converted into profit. If capitalists can't make use of someone's labor in order to turn a profit, then that person doesn't work, right? And so by working hard and producing a lot, workers put themselves in jeopardy of losing their job. And even the workers who don't lose their job, right, are kind of stuck because there's this whole population of workers who don't have a job and desperately want theirs. Page 784. If a surplus population of workers is a necessary product of accumulation or of the development of wealth on a capitalist basis, this surplus population also becomes conversely the lever of capitalist accumulation. Indeed, it becomes a condition for the existence of the capitalist mode of production. It forms a disposable industrial reserve army, which belongs to capital, just as absolutely as if the latter had bred it at its own cost. Independently of the limits of the actual increase of population, it creates a mass of human material, always ready for exploitation by capital in the interest of capital's own changing valorization requirements. What's he saying? The capitalist system requires a surplus labor population. There has to be a mass of workers who are unemployed at any given time, right? Think about this in terms of our unemployment rate. What's the unemployment rate now? I don't know, 4 or 5%, something like that. What's the lowest, or maybe let's first, what's the highest the unemployment rate's ever been? During the Great Depression, I think it was like, 1/3 or something, right? 1 out of 3 workers was out of work. What's the lowest it's ever been? Have they worked out their fucking deal of who's going to be the host of Jeopardy yet? I'm really interested in this. Has unemployment ever been 0? We've never had 0 unemployment? I mean, we come so close. Can't they just give jobs to the last 2 or 3% of people when the unemployment's so low? Everyone can be employed. Why doesn't the government, I mean, we just blew $2 trillion in Afghanistan for fucking nothing. Could we have used that money to employ unemployed people? Why will a capitalist government never, ever, ever do something like that? What happens if everyone has a job? And we, the workers, go to our boss and say, you know what? We're not really happy with this pay arrangement. Instead of you paying us a wage, why don't we just split the profit of the company among ourselves, equal shares? You could get an equal share too, but we'll all get equal shares. How about that? Right? What's the employer to say? I'll just go hire some other people to replace you. Not if employment's at 100%, right? In this case, the negotiation position has flipped, right? Now the workers have all the power in the negotiation. They can demand whatever wage they want as long as it doesn't exceed the profit of the firm, right? And the entrepreneur has no position because they have no other workers to hire to replace. They have to agree to whatever the workers want in order to be able to run the company in the first place. See how that works out? So a capitalist economy requires a surplus labor population, an industrial reserve army, as Marx puts it, right? An unemployment rate. We always have an unemployment rate. right? Because we need people to scab when workers in the active economy go on strike, right? Now, let's see, maybe I can just skip the. Think about the, instead of the quote, I'll just tell you, think about the surplus labor population, right? Is not just people who are completely unemployed, right? But people who are marginally employed as well, right? Anybody ever work, under the table, irregular hours? Sometimes you get hours, sometimes you don't. My best friend was in the laborers union for a couple of years. And there's a lot of politics in that union. And like sometimes he'd get on a job for a few months at a time and be balling. And then he'd go months without, he'd be on the books for months at a time. They wouldn't even send him to a new job site. So it's like, is he employed? I mean, technically he's employed because he's on the books with the union, but he's not actually working, right? So that's also a part of the surplus labor population, because whenever those construction companies need some more workers, they just pull the next 20, 30, 40, 50 names off the books to fill the vacancies, right? People who are employed in the underground economy, also part of the surplus labor population, right? People who hustle for a living. Who's going to hustle if you can actually find a job that pays more? Well, if they really need workers enough, they can start offering more money, and people are going to be, you know what? I can make the same money and not get arrested, right? If you really think about it, the surplus labor population is a lot of people who are actually employed full-time, but not employed in direct production. Think about the jobs you guys do. Does anybody here grow the food that comes out of the ground that we eat? Does anybody here extract resources from the earth? Or work in a factory manufacturing the commodities that we consume? Not a single one of you, is actually actively involved in production, producing the things that we actually need to sustain ourselves, to keep ourselves alive? Nobody, What do we do? Services, selling something that someone else manufactured, right? We're all part of the surplus labor population because we're not actually employed directly in producing things of value. In fact, if you think about it, a lot of the jobs they give us, kind of like kids, just to keep us busy. Anybody feel like the job they have is supposed to be like, you're serving the community and this, that, and the other, and then you work there and you're like, we're not doing shit. This is bullshit. But you can't quit because then you go hungry. Anybody start a job, starry-eyed with the best of intentions, and then after the first few months, you realize this shit is a fucking scam. We ain't doing the Lord's work over here, but what can I do? I gotta keep working, right? Best job I can find. All right. Next quote on 790 and 792. Taking them as a whole, the general movements of wages are exclusively regulated by the expansion and contraction of the Industrial Reserve Army. And this in turn corresponds to the periodic alternations of the industrial cycle. And on 792, the Industrial Reserve Army, during the periods of stagnation and average prosperity, weighs down the active army of workers. During the periods of overproduction and feverish activity, it puts a curb on their pretensions. The relative surplus population is therefore the background against which the law of the demand and supply of labor does its work. It confines the field of action of this law to the limits absolutely convenient to capital's drive to exploit and dominate workers. What does that mean? What is the effect of the surplus labor population on wages? Right? Well, production is not consistent, right, in a capitalist economy. Now, communist states tried to solve this problem by dictating the economy, a command economy, where they would tell everyone how much of everything they would produce and what it would be sold for. But in a capitalist commodity, in a capitalist economy, everyone's rationally pursuing their own self-interest, the invisible hand, right? Well, when prices are low and entrepreneurs, firms scale back production, right? What do they have to do with the workers? They got to let a lot of workers go. And if they have to let a lot of workers go, what happens to the wages of the existing workers? They're suppressed because there's all these people who want that person's job and are willing to do it for probably even less than that person is doing it for, right? So it keeps the wages of the people who are still lucky enough to have a job, it keeps their wages suppressed. Now, what happens when production expands, when prices increase, right? And firms seek to increase their production to capitalize on the higher prices. Well, then they start hiring people from this industrial reserve army of laborers, the surplus labor population. What does that do to the wages of people who've been working? They say, hey, we've been working all this time for this little. Now you need us even more. We want more wages. Well, we're hiring all these other people right now, and they're working for less than you. So we could just let you go and hire more of them. So no matter which way the economy fluctuates, right, whether production increases or decreases, the surplus labor population maintains wages at their lowest possible level. Does that make sense, guys? Any questions about any of this? I think that's the end of. Any questions, comments, any lies?
You said the surplus population is keeping what?
So the surplus labor population is artificially suppressing wages, right? It's keeping wages down. Because if the people who are already working, if they demand higher wages, then what does the firm do? It just fires them and hires people from the surplus labor population to replace them, right? We call those people scabs. But the people, to be fair to scabs, people in the surplus labor population are on the verge of starving. They'll work for whatever they can get. They're not in a position to, ask for anything better. So this whole system of surplus labor population regulating wages, right, suppresses everyone's interests, not everyone, suppresses all of the workers' interests, whether they're active or surplus labor, right? And it's obviously very much in the interests of capitalists, the entrepreneurs who are collecting the profit because they're able to minimize their labor costs and therefore maximize their profits. Cool. So I hope you all feel good about going to work this next week between now and our next class.
Professor, I actually have something to add to the discussion.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So what is your kind of perspective on the current labor shortage or wage shortage, I guess, depending on where you get your news from?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of economists who'd love to explain this, right? But to me, it seems pretty obvious that workers have reached a point where they've decided that they're not willing to die for the wages they're being paid. Working, we have a service economy. So most jobs are people, and you see this everywhere. I see this every fucking restaurant I go to, they got these little signs up front. We can't hire anyone, so please, don't give us a bad Yelp review, basically, right? Well, service jobs in the middle of a pandemic are dangerous. You're being exposed to the general public and a whole lot of it, right? Now, some of those people are essential, right? Like people who work at supermarkets, right? Fucking heroes who were giving us the food. So at least we could go and get food from the supermarket while we were all in quarantine the first 6 months or whatever, right? And that's why they get paid more than people who are working at restaurants who are more superfluous to the economy, right? So basically, my view is that workers who have been working in the service economy for minimum wage or close to it have decided that it's not worth risking their lives for $15 an hour when they can collect unemployment in the meantime, or hustle, or get a job under the table, or hopefully, or move in with family, or whatever the case may be, right? Like actually this worked to my advantage because obviously I'm on salary, so I didn't lose any wage. But a lot of the people moved out of LA or moved out of their own apartment and moved in with family, right? Especially all like the out-of-towners, all the hipsters that come here because they want to be a movie star and stuff, and they all work at restaurants and bars and shit like that. All those people fucking packed it up and went back to the Midwest or wherever the hell they came from, right? All the bars and restaurants and shit shut down. Like I have some friends that live in West Hollywood, like half their buildings emptied out. Half the apartments that used to be like $4,000 a month, half the people moved out, right? So I actually hated my previous landlord and decided to start looking for a new place when my lease ran up, and found a much nicer place for cheaper than we were paying. Economics. Right. So, but these are obviously, I think, exceptions that are due to the pandemic, right? This isn't your normal economy. Any other questions or comments? All right, so I will see you next Thursday. Your papers are due next Thursday as well. If you have any, I'll be checking my email. So if you have any problems, just shoot me an email. But basically, the key thing to keep in mind is that there are those very specific questions on the prompt. And literally all I'm looking for is, have you provided an answer that convinces me that you understand what the question is asking? Right? I don't care what your politics are. I don't care, you're welcome to say that I disagree with this, or I disagree with that, or I agree with this. This is, this makes a lot of sense to me, or you're welcome to add any personal anecdotes. But what I'm looking for is, did you answer the question? Like I literally scanned through your papers. Did they answer question 1? Check. 2, there it is, check. 3, there it is, check. The only way you're not going to get full credit is if you don't answer some of the questions, or you answer the questions in such a way, I'm not grading you on your writing, but if I can't make sense of what the hell you're trying to say, right, then I can't give you credit, right? Or number 3, what you say is just plain wrong, right? So I'm not grading you on whether you agree with any of this. I'm just grading you purely on were you able to make sense of the material, right? And if you have a satisfactory answer to all the questions, then you get full credit. It's that simple. Cool.
Would you upload today's notes?
I think they are there, are they not?
Oh, I didn't see them. I tried to check and I didn't find them.
Let me look real quick.
You're gonna also upload the recording note today, right?
Yeah, I won't upload it today because it takes forever to translate. But probably tomorrow I'll be able to. Actually, tomorrow I got to run around, do a couple things for the book. But within a couple days, I'll get it up there. Let's see.
Could it be no later than Saturday, please?
Oh, I don't have the notes here. Okay, so no later than Saturday for sure. I'll try my best to get it up tomorrow. And right after class right now, I'll upload the notes. I'm sorry, I did that for the other section, but I forgot about you guys.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Any other questions or comments or concerns? Plutocracy, the link is on your syllabus. You can also just Google Plutocracy Metanoia Films and watch it off of their website. Make sure you're watching episode 1. I think there's 5 episodes now or something, but I'm only holding you for the first one. Cool. All right. Have a lovely weekend. I will see you next Thursday. Salud.